Thank you, Dr. Osteen. As Dr. Osteen said, my name is Kelly Mueller. I'm a senior classics history double major. And this past summer, I spent researching the relationship between Josephus, who was a Judeo-Roman historian at the end of the 1st century AD, and his relationship with the city of Rome. While I was not able to fit all of my research into this presentation, because honestly I could probably talk for about an hour about this, I do hope that what I present today will give you a scope of the research that I did this past summer and that will continue this year as part of my independent study. Nope, wrong way. So these are two images that represent what people think Josephus might have looked like, but we don't know we don't have any actual representations of Josephus made from his time. So take these with a grain of salt, please. Josephus is an interesting figure due to his surviving writings and his role in the Second Judeo-Roman War. Born in Judea in 37 CE as Joseph ben Matthias, he was educated and trained as a Jewish priest and worked in the Temple of Jerusalem. At the age of 24, Josephus traveled to Rome as a part of a Judean delegation to the Emperor Nero. Josephus was immediately impressed with the grandeur of the city. The physical city of Rome effectively communicated Rome's power to its inhabitants and its visitors. Josephus understood this message, so when he returned to Jerusalem, he feared catastrophe if the Jews ever decided to rebel against their conquerors. When the rebellion did begin, he unwillingly found himself in the middle of the conflict. He led Judean forces in Galilee against the Roman general Vespasian, who arrived in May of 67, and besieged towns across the region, including Josephus' center of command, Jotapata. After a few months, the city fell, and Josephus surrendered to Vespasian and his son, Titus. They did free him 2 years later when Vespasian claimed the throne after winning a civil war. Josephus, then freed, accompanied Titus throughout Judea, including during the siege of Jerusalem, where Titus's troops looted, set fire to, and destroyed the Temple of Jerusalem, as well as parts of the city. The Jewish revolt had failed. Afterwards, Josephus settled in Rome and lived there for the rest of his life. Unlike his old life in Judea, Josephus recorded very little of his new life in Rome. We do know that Josephus wrote all of his major works during this period. Indeed, most of what we know about the Jewish community during this period, the Jewish War, and Josephus' life itself come from these writings. As you can imagine, Josephus is a controversial figure, mostly because some view him as a traitor. But Josephus' works are important because they are among the very few remaining sources for these issues, and they are indispensable to understanding this pivotal moment in the history of the Jewish community and Western civilization. Thus, thousands of pages have been dedicated to making sense of the accuracy and the biases within Josephus' writings. Few pages, however, have been dedicated to Josephus' relationship with the city in which he lived for the last 30 years of his life. Because Josephus wrote so little about his time in Rome, many significant questions remain unanswered. What did Josephus see as he moved around the city? And how did those sights, often reminders of the defeat of his own people, affect him? In an attempt to answer these questions, my research investigated how Josephus would have interacted with certain aspects of the city, namely the explicit and implicit reminders of the fall of Jerusalem that appeared in Rome following the Jewish War. So these are the 3 Flavian emperors. They all have the family name Flavius, so that's how they're known. Vespasian was the main general against the Judeans, and his 2 sons ruled after him, Titus and Domitian. When Vespasian became emperor at the end of 69 CE, he inherited an empire stretched thin by corruption and civil war. Emperor Nero died in 68, and the chaotic year of 4 emperors commenced. 3 different men claimed the throne before Vespasian emerged victorious. In order to distance himself from Nero, his corrupt and bizarre predecessor, Vespasian embarked on a campaign to restore the traditional morals of the city. He celebrated his victory over the Jewish people, which in the Roman view was a restoration of peace. He started creating more public spaces and facilities within the center of the city. These projects, such as the Colosseum, gave the Roman people areas that Nero had claimed after a devastating fire. Rome became a beehive of construction as Vespasian put his plans into action, funded largely by the profits from the Jewish war. Josephus would have been living in the city as these buildings were constructed, and they would have formed the background of the rest of his life in Rome. Yes. This is a relief from the Arch of Titus depicting a victorious general, Titus, on his chariot during a triumphal parade. I believe that there is a way to understand how Josephus interacted with the monuments that reminded him of the Jewish war. Towards the end of his account, Josephus gives this narrative of Vespasian's triumphal parade. Triumphs, as depicted here, were voted by the Senate to thank the gods and honor victorious generals. Vespasian's parade, like all others, started outside of the city and then followed a specific route to the most important temple to Jupiter, Rome's chief god. This huge parade passed through the heart of the city, ensuring that everyone would have the chance to see Vespasian and his troops, as well as the exotic objects, animals, and people that represented Judea and spurred the imagination. Romans would have delighted to see all this opulence and majesty march past them, a testament to their power and might. On the other hand, foreigners or conquered provincials would have had a very different reaction to the parade. Feelings could have varied anywhere between fear and sorrow. This overbearing display of imperial power certainly would have reminded them of the destruction of their own homes, awe likely mixed with resentment. Josephus' reaction was likely more complex because he had lived two lives at odds with each other. He spent one as a devout Jewish priest and rebel officer. The other he spent helping the Romans obliterate his home, community, and his old way of life. While Josephus does not explicitly say how the triumph made him feel, the things upon which he focuses in the narrative betray his emotions. These objects reminded him of his old life and the catastrophic destruction of Jerusalem. These objects reminded him of his old life and help us begin to understand how Josephus would have responded to the constant reminders of Jewish pain and loss that filled the city of Rome. This is an artist's representation of what the Temple of Jerusalem might have looked like before it was destroyed during the war. As you can see, it's vast and looks like a very central place to the Jewish community, because it was. Josephus focuses on pictorial scenes of the war and the tumult of the procession. These scenes were carried throughout the city in order to give the onlookers a better understanding of the major points of the war. Mind you, the Romans didn't have CNN or other media outlets to send them videos of the war or send political messages, so they had to make do with what they had. One of the scenes that Josephus mentions is temples set on fire, which certainly would have reminded Josephus of the fire at the Temple of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Jewish way of life. The tradition of temple sacrifice as the ancient Jews' fundamental religious practice ceased to exist, and Josephus would have felt this intimately due to his role as a temple priest. This relief on the other side of the arch from the previous relief I showed you shows the temple treasures being carried in procession. Josephus' description of the war spoils being carried past is quite revealing. Josephus specifically mentions treasures only from the temple. He highlights the importance of the shewbread table, where priests set out bread for God on the Sabbath, and the importance of the golden menorah. Lastly, a copy of the Torah was carried past, assuming the place of honor because it was the last of all treasures. Considering that Josephus is writing for a Roman audience, it is strange that he does not give a wider inventory of the spoils. He does describe the array of treasure as resembling a flowing river, but doesn't provide any specific details. Perhaps Josephus was moved and saddened by the objects which reminded him of his Jewish life and the loss associated with the sack of Jerusalem. He was able to linger on the few objects most meaningful to his life as a priest, but assembling a longer catalog could have been painful. Despite feeling the wrenching pain of losing his community all over again, it was not conventional in antiquity for a writer to include personal feelings in his history. At most, it should be implied. Nevertheless, these objects were particularly meaningful for Josephus. These potentially painful reminders of his previous life did not end when the parade did. Besides the unambiguous expressions of power that crushed Josephus' revolt, Rome also housed temples and monuments that honored Vespasian's victory over the Jews. But because of the constraints of this presentation, I will only address the most famous example, the Colosseum. What the Colosseum looks like today is on the left. I actually took that picture while abroad last semester. And then on the right is an inscription from the Colosseum, which I will address in a short moment. Vespasian transformed the space occupied by an artificial lake in Nero's pleasure palace into the Colosseum. It sat around 50,000 people with a hierarchical seating arrangement. The most important members of Roman society, including the emperor and the senators, sat closest to the arena, while women and the poorest men sat at the top. Each visitor would enter through an assigned entrance numbered 1 through 80. This may sound familiar because this is how most major sporting arenas seat their guests. In each of the entrances, there would have been an abbreviated explanation of who commissioned the structure and how it was built. The main inscription, of course, would have been in the main entrance. In 1995, Dr. Geza Al-Foldi deciphered this abbreviated inscription from the holes remaining on a large slab of marble. The inscription roughly translates to, the Emperor Titus Caesar Vespasian Augustus ordered this new amphitheater to be built from the proceeds of the booty from the Jewish war. For the Romans, this was certainly something to celebrate. When Vespasian was proclaimed emperor, the imperial treasury was nearly empty, and the city was in need of repair and reconstruction. Vespasian smartly used his portion of the spoils from the war to finance construction across the entire city. This reminder was a continued source of pride. They had defeated the Jews, and peace was restored. But for any Jew going into or even walking past the Colosseum, including Josephus, this inscription would have been a very poignant reminder of Rome's power and prosperity at the expense of the Jewish community. This message, paired with the overall message of power and conquest that the Colosseum's gladiatorial spectacles conveyed, would have been an inescapable reminder of pain and loss. No matter where Josephus went in Rome, he would have had regular reminders of the loss of the temple in the form of monuments, reminders, too, of the loss of his first life. While we cannot know for certain how Josephus would have reacted to these physical reminders, it is clear from his description of the triumph that any reminder of Jerusalem would have commanded Josephus' attention and thus his heart. Thank you.